The morning I found 17 strangers passed out on my grandfather's hand-carved porch, I knew my peaceful retirement had just turned into a war I never asked to fight. My name is David, and 6 months ago, I thought I'd found paradise. After 35 years of teaching high school history, I'd finally bought my dream property, a rustic cabin on 12 acres with private lake access in what I believed was an unincorporated area of Montana. The listing never mentioned an HOA. The realtor never breathed a word about covenants. And absolutely nobody warned me about Patricia Hendricks. But Patricia knew about me from the moment I signed those papers. She'd been watching, waiting, and planning something that would nearly cost me everything I'd worked my entire life to achieve. Standing there in my pajamas, staring at beer cans floating in my pristine lake and strangers sleeping in lawn chairs I'd never seen before, I had no idea that this was just the beginning. What started as trespassing would escalate into harassment, legal manipulation, and a conspiracy so calculated it would shake our entire community to its core. By the time this story ends, I would uncover family secrets buried for decades, expose corruption that reached into our county courthouse, and make a decision so drastic it would literally drain the life out of our neighborhood lake. But Patricia pushed me to that point, step by calculated step. And it all started with a knock on my door at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the day I first laid eyes on this property. It was late April, and I'd driven 4 hours from Billings after seeing the listing online. The moment my truck rounded that final bend, and I saw the cabin nestled between towering pines with the lake shimmering beyond, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: pure peace. The realtor, a friendly woman named Sarah, walked me around the property boundaries, pointing out the hand-dug well, the original stone fireplace, and the small dock my grandfather had apparently built himself back in the 1960s. Wait, I remember saying, stopping mid-step. My grandfather? That's when I learned the incredible truth. This property had belonged to my mother's father, a man I'd barely known who'd passed when I was 7. Through a series of estate complications and family disconnections, the land had eventually gone to tax auction. Sarah explained that my family name had somehow remained attached to the deed research, which is how she'd reached out to me when the current owners decided to sell. I was buying back my own family's land. The transaction was surprisingly smooth. No HOA documents appeared in the closing paperwork. No mention of community fees or architectural committees. Just a clean deed to 12 acres, a 3-bedroom log cabin, and private access to Cedar Lake, a pristine, spring-fed body of water that had been in our family for over 60 years. I moved in on a Thursday in May, driving my moving truck down the gravel road that wound through thick forest before opening up to my private clearing. The neighbors seemed distant, but friendly enough I could see a few other cabins scattered around the lake, but everyone appeared to respect each other's privacy. Perfect for a newly retired teacher who wanted nothing more than to fish, read, and finally write the novel I'd been putting off for decades. For 3 blissful weeks, that's exactly what I did. I woke up each morning to the sound of loons calling across still water. I spent my afternoons on the dock, working on lesson plans for the substitute teaching I planned to do part-time. In the evenings, I'd build a small fire in the stone pit behind the cabin and watch the sun disappear behind the mountains. It felt like the life I was always meant to live. Then Patricia Hendricks introduced herself. She arrived on a Sunday morning at exactly 9 o'clock, dressed in what I can only describe as suburban armor, pressed khakis, a polo shirt with an embroidered logo I couldn't quite make out, and a clipboard that she carried like a weapon. She was probably in her early 60s, with short gray hair and the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. "You must be David," she said, not waiting for me to confirm. "I'm Patricia Hendricks. president of the Cedar Lake Homeowners Association. Welcome to the neighborhood. I blinked at her, coffee mug halfway to my lips. I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. This property isn't part of any HOA. Her smile grew sharper. Oh, but it is. The covenants were recorded in 1987, well before your purchase. I have all the documentation right here. She flipped through her clipboard with practiced efficiency, producing a thick stack of papers. These are your community guidelines, architectural standards, and fee schedule. Your first quarterly assessment of $450 was actually due last week, so you're already in violation. I set my coffee down carefully, trying to process what she was telling me. Ma'am, I think you're mistaken. My realtor never mentioned any HOA. It wasn't in my closing documents. Realtors make mistakes, Patricia said dismissively. The covenants run with the land. Ignorance isn't a defense. She pointed toward my dock, where I'd left my fishing gear from the previous evening. Speaking of violations, personal watercraft equipment can only be stored in approved storage structures. You'll need to build a shed within 30 days, following our architectural guidelines, or face daily fines. My peaceful retirement morning was rapidly becoming a nightmare. Look, Mrs. Hendricks. Mrs. Hendricks, she corrected sharply. And I prefer Patricia. We're going to be working together closely to bring your property into compliance. She began walking around my cabin without invitation, making notes on her clipboard. The exterior stain is the wrong color we require mountain cedar, not whatever this reddish tone is. Your garden area is outside the approved landscaping zones. And this fire pit. She shook her head disapprovingly. Fire features require written approval and annual inspections. I followed her around my own property, feeling increasingly violated and confused. Mrs. Hendricks, even if there is an HO, surely my grandfather would have been involved when these covenants were created. This land has been in my family since the early 1960s. Something flickered in her expression just for a moment, but I caught it. A brief tightening around her eyes, like I'd struck a nerve. That's irrelevant, she said, but her voice had lost some of its authority. Current ownership is bound by current covenants. I'll expect your first payment within 5 business days. She handed me the stack of papers and headed back toward the road, where I now noticed a white SUV parked with military precision exactly parallel to the tree line. What happens if I don't pay? I called after her. She turned back, and that cold smile returned full force. Oh, David, you really don't want to find out. As her SUV disappeared down the gravel road, I stood there holding 47 pages of HOA regulations for a community I didn't know I'd joined, feeling like I'd just been served notice that my peaceful retirement was over. I had no idea how right I was or how much worse things were about to get. The harassment started small, the way it always does with people like Patricia. 3 days after her visit, I found a formal violation notice zip-tied to my mailbox post. Apparently, my truck was parked inappropriately in my own driveway. The notice included a grainy photograph taken from the road showing my Ford F-150 angled slightly toward the cabin instead of perfectly parallel to the street. Fine, $25 per day until corrected. I moved the truck, shaking my head at the pettiness. But the next morning brought another notice. This time, my crime was leaving a coffee mug on my porch railing personal items displayed outside approved areas. Another $25 daily fine. By the end of that first week, I'd accumulated over $300 in fines for infractions I couldn't have imagined existed. Each violation came with the same professionally printed notice, complete with timestamps and photographs taken from various angles around my property. Someone was watching me very carefully. I decided to fight back through proper channels. The HOA documents Patricia had given me mentioned monthly board meetings held at the community center in town. I circled the date on my calendar and prepared to confront this situation head-on. The meeting was held in a small conference room that smelled like industrial coffee and defeat. Besides Patricia, only 3 other people attended: an elderly couple named the Johnsons and a nervous-looking man in his 40s, who introduced himself as Marcus. "David," Patricia beamed as I walked in, as if we were old friends. "Everyone, this is our newest resident. He's having some trouble adjusting to community standards." Mrs. Johnson, a frail woman with kind eyes, smiled apologetically. "These things do take time. We've all been here so long, we forget how overwhelming it can seem at first." "How long have you lived here?" I asked, taking a seat across from Patricia. "Oh, nearly 15 years now," Mr. Johnson replied. "Bought our place right after Patricia established the HOA. Wonderful thing she did, really. Property values have never been higher." I felt a chill run down my spine. Patricia established the HOA? Patricia's expression didn't change, but I saw her pen stop moving across her notepad. I was instrumental in organizing it, yes. Someone had to take responsibility for protecting our community's character. In 1987, I pressed. Now she looked up sharply. The covenants were recorded in 1987. The Active Homeowners Association was organized later as properties changed hands and new residents recognized the need for community standards. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Actually, I thought the HOA was formed in 2003 when you moved here, Patricia. That's what you told me when I bought my place." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Patricia's smile never wavered, but her voice carried a warning. "Marcus, I think you're confusing some details. Memory can be unreliable." But I wasn't going to let this go. "Mrs. Hendricks, I'd like to see the original covenant documents, the recorded ones from 1987. And I'd like to understand how my grandfather's property became subject to covenants that were supposedly created 25 years after he owned it." Patricia set down her pen very carefully. "David, I can see you're having trouble accepting the legal realities of your situation. Perhaps you should consult with an attorney if you have concerns about the property's covenant status." "Maybe I will," I said. "That's your right," she replied. "Of course, legal challenges against the HOA result in automatic suspension of lake privileges until resolution. I'd hate to see you lose access to the water during our beautiful summer months." The threat was clear and completely illegal, but delivered with such casual authority that I could see Marcus and the Johnsons accepting it as legitimate. This was how Patricia operated, through intimidation disguised as procedure, backed by just enough official-sounding language to make people afraid to challenge her. I left that meeting more determined than ever to fight back. The next morning, I drove to the county recorder's office in town. What I discovered there changed everything. The woman behind the counter, a cheerful middle-aged clerk named Helen, was incredibly helpful. She pulled up the property records for my address and began printing page after page of documents. "Interesting property," she commented as the printer churned. "We don't see many that go back this far with such a clear chain of title." She handed me the stack of papers, and I began reading immediately. Deed records, tax assessments, survey maps, all clearly showing uninterrupted family ownership from 1962 through 1994, when the property went to tax auction after my grandfather's estate was settled. But here's what wasn't there: any recorded covenants, restrictions, or HOA documents dated 1987 or any other year. "Helen," I said carefully, "if covenants had been recorded against this property, they'd show up in these records, right?" "Absolutely. Covenants, easements, restrictions, anything that runs with a land has to be recorded here to be enforceable. It's the law." I felt a surge of victory, followed immediately by a wave of anger. Patricia had been lying from the very beginning. There were no legal covenants, no legitimate HOA, no enforceable fines. I was being scammed. But when I got home that afternoon, flush with righteous anger and armed with proof, I discovered that Patricia had escalated things far beyond fake fines and harassment. My front door was standing wide open. I approached carefully, heart pounding. From inside, I could hear voices, multiple people talking and laughing like they owned the place. I crept up to the porch and peered through the screen door. 4 strangers were sitting in my living room, drinking beer and watching my television. A woman I'd never seen before was in my kitchen, making herself a sandwich with food from my refrigerator. "Excuse me?" I said, stepping through my own front door. "What the hell are you people doing in my house?" The woman in the kitchen turned around, holding my mayo jar like it was perfectly normal. "Oh, hi? Are you David? Patricia said you wouldn't mind if we used the cabin for our book club meeting." The community center was double booked. I stared at her in disbelief. "Patricia said what?" One of the men on my couch chimed in without taking his eyes off the TV. "Yeah, she mentioned you were having some adjustment issues, but that you'd be happy to contribute to community activities. Great place you got here." They weren't being malicious. They genuinely believed they had permission to be in my home. Patricia had somehow convinced these people that my property was available for community use. "I'm sorry, but you all need to leave immediately," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is my private home, and you don't have permission to be here." The cheerful atmosphere evaporated. The woman in my kitchen set down the mayo jar with a frown. But Patricia specifically said, "I don't care what Patricia said. This is breaking and entering, and I want you out now." They left, grumbling and confused, and I immediately changed all my locks. But the damage was done. Word spread quickly through the small community that I was uncooperative and hostile to neighbors. Over the next 2 weeks, the incidents escalated. My mailbox was repeatedly vandalized. Someone dumped trash on my driveway 3 different nights. My truck tires were deflated twice. Each morning brought new evidence that I was being systematically harassed by people who believed they were fighting a legitimate community battle against an unreasonable newcomer. Patricia was orchestrating all of it, I was certain, but she was too clever to leave direct evidence. When I called the sheriff's department, they took a report but explained that without witnesses or proof of who was responsible, there wasn't much they could do. "Property disputes like this usually work themselves out," the deputy told me. "Maybe try talking to your neighbors, see if you can find some middle ground." But there was no middle ground with Patricia Hendricks. She wanted complete control, and I was standing in her way. The situation came to a head on a Thursday evening in late June. I'd spent the day in town, meeting with a real estate attorney who confirmed what I already knew: there were no enforceable covenants against my property, and Patricia's HOA had no legal standing. I came home feeling vindicated, ready to confront Patricia with legal facts and put an end to this harassment once and for all. Instead, I discovered that my quiet lakefront property had been turned into what looked like a college fraternity party. Cars were parked everywhere on my grass, blocking my driveway, even on the narrow dirt road that served as the only access to my property. Music was blasting from somewhere near the lake. I could see people swimming in the water, others gathered around what appeared to be a bonfire on my beach. And standing in the middle of it all, directing traffic like she owned the place, was Patricia Hendricks. I parked at the end of my own driveway, blocked by 3 cars I didn't recognize, and walked toward the chaos. Patricia spotted me immediately and approached with that same cold smile. "David, perfect timing. We're having our annual community lake celebration. I thought it was important to include your property this year, help you feel more connected to the neighborhood. I looked around at the 20 or 30 people who had turned my peaceful retreat into a nightmare. Get them out, now. Now, David, don't be antisocial. Community participation is part of property ownership here. It's in the covenants. There are no covenants, I said loudly enough for nearby people to hear. I've been to the county recorder's office. You've been lying to everyone. For the first time since I'd met her, Patricia's composure cracked slightly. A few people had stopped their conversations to listen, and I could see doubt creeping into their expressions. David, you're obviously confused, she said, but her voice lacked its usual authority. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. No, I interrupted. We're going to discuss this right here, in front of all these people. You've convinced that I'm some kind of community villain. I pulled out the county records I'd brought with me and began explaining what I'd discovered. No recorded covenants. No legal HOA. No enforceable community rules. But Patricia was far from defeated. As I spoke, I watched her face transform from embarrassed confusion to something much more dangerous, cold calculation. Well, she said when I finished, I can see we have a serious misunderstanding here. She turned to address the crowd that had gathered around us. It seems David has discovered some paperwork irregularities. While we sort this out through proper legal channels, I'm afraid we'll need to suspend his lake access privileges until everything is resolved. You can't do that, I said. This is my property. That's my lake access. Patricia's smile returned, sharper than ever. Actually, David, I think you'll find that lake access is a community privilege, not an individual right. And privileges can be revoked. What happened next still gives me nightmares. Within an hour, Patricia had convinced most of the partygoers that I was trying to destroy their community tradition through legal technicalities. By the time the last car left my property at nearly midnight, I'd been branded as the enemy, a selfish newcomer who wanted to ruin everything for established residents. But worse than the social ostracism was the threat Patricia made as she was leaving, quiet enough that only I could hear it. You have no idea who you're dealing with, David. This lake has been my responsibility for 20 years, and I won't let some bitter old teacher destroy what I've built here. As her SUV disappeared into the darkness, I realized that this war was far from over. Patricia had escalated from harassment to invasion, and she just declared that she considered the lake, my family's lake, to be her responsibility. I was about to find out exactly what she meant by that, and why she was so determined to control property that had never legally belonged to her community. The truth, as I would soon discover, was far more personal and much more devastating than I could have imagined. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: my mother's old photo albums. After the disastrous community celebration on my property, I'd spent several sleepless nights trying to understand why Patricia was so determined to control my land. Her reaction when I mentioned my grandfather had been telling, but I couldn't piece together the connection. Frustrated and running out of options, I decided to drive back to Billings to dig through the family belongings I'd inherited when my mother passed 5 years earlier. Most of her things were stored in a climate-controlled unit I'd been meaning to sort through for months. It took me most of a Saturday, but buried in a box labeled Dad's Things, I found what I was looking for: dozens of photographs of the lake property from the 1960s and 70s, along with letters, receipts, and legal documents my mother had apparently saved. The photos were a revelation. Image after image showed my grandfather's cabin exactly as it looked now, but in the background of several shots, I could see something I hadn't expected: another structure on the far side of the lake. It was a small A-frame cabin, and in one clear photograph from 1974, I could see people on its deck. A family. By the look of it, a man, a woman, and what appeared to be a teenage girl with long dark hair. I studied that girl's face for a long time. There was something familiar about her features, something that nagged at the edge of my memory. Then I found the letters. They were addressed to my grandfather from someone named Robert Hendricks, and they spanned nearly a decade from 1965 to 1974. The early letters were friendly, neighborly correspondence between property owners who shared the lake. Robert thanked my grandfather for helping with dock repairs, mentioned good fishing spots, and generally maintained the tone of people who enjoyed their mutual privacy and natural surroundings. But as the years progressed, the letters changed. By 1970, Robert was writing about problems with Patricia and asking my grandfather's advice about teenage troubles. The girl, apparently his daughter, had been caught multiple times trespassing on other properties around the lake, including my grandfather's land. She seems to think she has some kind of right to the entire lake, Robert wrote in 1972. No matter how many times I explain property lines, she acts like the whole area belongs to her. Yesterday, I found her in your old fishing spot, and when I told her to come home, she said she'd been there longer than you and had more right to it. The final letter, dated September 1974, was heartbreaking. Robert explained that Patricia had been arrested for vandalizing several properties around the lake, including breaking windows and damaging docks. He was selling the A-frame and moving his family away from the area. "I'm sorry to leave such good neighbors," he wrote, "but Patricia's behavior has become impossible to manage. She's convinced herself that she's the rightful guardian of this lake, and I fear what she might do if we stay. Perhaps distance and time will help her understand boundaries." I sat back in my mother's old storage unit, stunned by what I'd just learned. Patricia Hendricks had been obsessed with controlling Cedar Lake for over 50 years. She'd grown up there, been forced to leave as a teenager, and had apparently spent decades working her way back to a position where she could claim dominion over the entire area. But there was more. At the bottom of the box, I found a legal document that made everything click into place, a quitclaim deed dated 1975, transferring Robert Hendricks' property to someone named Patricia Hendricks Morrison. She'd somehow acquired her father's old property, the A-frame cabin that no longer existed. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and called Helen at the county recorder's office. "Helen, it's David. I need you to run another property search for me. I'm looking for any records under the name Patricia Hendricks or Patricia Hendricks Morrison, specifically around Cedar Lake." 20 minutes later, Helen called me back with information that changed everything. "David, this is fascinating. There are records for a Patricia Hendricks Morrison who owned property on Cedar Lake from 1975 to 1994. But here's the interesting part. She lost it to tax foreclosure the same year your grandfather's property went to auction. It looks like she couldn't keep up with the property taxes after her divorce." My blood ran cold. She lost her property in 1994? That's right. And David? Her foreclosed property was eventually sold to a development company that demolished the existing cabin and subdivided the land. It's now those 3 newer houses on the south side of the lake. I hung up the phone and stared at the photographs scattered around me. Patricia hadn't just been forced away from the lake as a teenager, she'd fought her way back, owned property there for nearly 20 years, and then lost it all to financial problems, right around the time my family was also losing our land to estate issues. But while I'd been able to buy back my family's property decades later, Patricia's land was gone forever, divided, developed, and sold to strangers. No wonder she was so desperate to control the lake. In her mind, she was the area's rightful guardian, the person who'd sacrificed the most and lost the most. My return with a legal claim to lakefront property wasn't just an inconvenience to her, it was a personal betrayal by the universe itself. I understood her now, but understanding didn't mean I was going to surrender my family's land to her psychological needs. I packed up the photos and documents and drove back to the cabin with a plan forming in my mind. If Patricia wanted to play legal games, I was ready to show her what real legal authority looked like. But when I arrived at my property that evening, I discovered that Patricia had made her own plans, and they were far more destructive than I'd imagined. My dock was gone. Not damaged or vandalized, completely gone, as if it had never existed. The wooden platform my grandfather had built with his own hands, the sturdy posts he'd sunk deep into the lake bottom, the metal hardware that had withstood decades of Montana weather, all of it had been systematically removed. In its place was a hand-painted sign driven into the muddy shore. COMMUNITYLAKE, SCCESSN, EEPRIV, TEDOCK, SPEARMITE, ITAE, BABR, AAAE, EEYA, AAKA. I stood there in the fading daylight, looking at the empty space where my connection to the lake had been, and felt something inside me shift. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was destruction of my family's legacy, and it had crossed a line I didn't even know existed. But Patricia had made one crucial mistake in her campaign against me. By destroying my dock, she'd committed a crime that could be proven theft and destruction of property. And unlike her previous harassment, this time there were witnesses. Mrs. Johnson was waiting for me when I walked back up to my cabin, wringing her hands nervously. "David, I'm so sorry," she said. "I tried to stop them, but Patricia said it was legal, that the HOA had authority over all lake improvements." "Who helped her remove it?" I asked. "Marcus and two men I didn't recognize. They had a barge and power tools. The whole thing took them most of the afternoon." I pulled out my phone and took detailed photographs of the empty dock area and Patricia's sign. Then I called the sheriff's department and filed a formal complaint for theft and destruction of property, naming Patricia Hendricks as the primary suspect. But I wasn't done. The next morning, I drove to the county seat and filed something that would change the entire dynamic of this conflict, a formal complaint with the county attorney's office alleging fraud and extortion by Patricia Hendricks in her operation of a fictitious homeowners association. It was time to stop playing defense. Patricia had declared war on my family's legacy, and I was about to show her what 40 years of teaching difficult teenagers had taught me about dealing with bullies. You don't negotiate with them. You don't try to appease them. You document everything, build an airtight case, and then you strike back with overwhelming legal force. But first, I needed to understand exactly what Patricia had been doing to other property owners around the lake, and whether I was her first victim or just her latest one. The truth I uncovered would shock me, enrage me, and ultimately lead to the most drastic decision I've ever made in my life. The county attorney's office took my fraud complaint seriously, but what really got their attention was the pattern of similar complaints they'd been receiving for the past 18 months. Attorney Sarah Mitchell, a sharp woman in her 40s who specialized in real estate fraud, asked me to come in for a formal interview the week after I filed my complaint. "Mr. Davidson," she said, spreading a thick file across her desk, "your situation isn't unique. We've had 7 other property owners around Cedar Lake file complaints about Mrs. Hendricks and her alleged homeowners association." She showed me complaint after complaint property owners who'd been harassed, fined, and intimidated by Patricia's fictitious HOA. An elderly widower who'd paid over $3,000 in fake fees before his son discovered the scam. A young couple who'd been prevented from building a legitimate addition to their cabin because Patricia claimed it violated non-existent architectural standards. "Why hasn't anyone arrested her?" I asked. "Because she's been very careful to stay just inside the boundaries of civil rather than criminal fraud," Sarah explained. "She's never explicitly claimed legal authority, she just strongly implies it and lets people assume. When challenged, she claims she's providing voluntary community services. But stealing my dock isn't voluntary community service." No, it's not. And that's why your complaint is the key we've been waiting for. She finally committed a clear, provable crime with multiple witnesses. Sarah explained that the county was prepared to file criminal charges against Patricia, but they wanted to coordinate the timing with a civil lawsuit that would shut down her fake HOA operation permanently. "We'd like you to be our lead plaintiff," she said. "Your case is the strongest. You have clear property rights, documented harassment, and proof of destruction of property. Are you willing to take this all the way?" I thought about my grandfather's dock, lying in pieces somewhere, about the months of harassment and intimidation, about the other property owners who'd been victimized by Patricia's obsession with controlling the lake. "Yes," I said. "Let's do it." The legal wheels turned slowly but inevitably. While the county attorney's office prepared criminal charges, Sarah helped me file a comprehensive civil lawsuit against Patricia for fraud, harassment, trespass, and destruction of property. But Patricia wasn't going down without a fight. 2 days after she was served with the lawsuit papers, she called an emergency HOA meeting and invited every property owner around the lake. I wasn't officially invited, but Mrs. Johnson called to let me know about it. "She's telling everyone that you're trying to destroy the community," Mrs. Johnson whispered over the phone. "She says you're working with outside lawyers to eliminate all property protections and turn the lake into a commercial development." I realized that Patricia was making one last desperate play, trying to turn the entire community against me before the truth about her fake HOA became public knowledge. The meeting was held at the community center on a Thursday evening. I arrived early and positioned myself at the back of the room where I could observe without being immediately noticed. About 30 people showed up, nearly every property owner around the lake, plus several I didn't recognize who Patricia had apparently invited as supporters. She'd prepared extensively, with charts and graphs showing property values, before and after photos of various improvements around the lake, and a presentation about the legal threats facing their community. "David Davidson moved here 6 months ago," she told the assembled crowd, "and he's been systematically trying to destroy everything we've built together. He's filed frivolous lawsuits, harassment complaints, and now he's working with county officials to eliminate our homeowners association entirely." She clicked through slides showing my property, including telephoto shots of my cabin, my truck, and even me working in my garden. The invasion of privacy was stunning, but what really bothered me was how convincing her presentation was. If I didn't know the truth about her fictitious HOA, I might have been swayed by her passionate defense of community values. "The lake protection covenants we've maintained for decades are under attack," she continued. "If David succeeds with his lawsuit, there will be nothing to stop inappropriate development, commercial use, or environmental destruction of our shared natural resources." She was building towards some kind of climax, and I could see the audience growing increasingly agitated about the supposed threat I represented to their community. Then she revealed her masterstroke, which is why I've been in discussions with Clearwater Development Corporation about acquiring lake access rights to ensure permanent conservation protections, she announced. They've made a generous offer to purchase community lake access for $2.3 million, which would be held in trust to guarantee that Cedar Lake remains pristine forever. The room erupted in surprised discussion. I felt my stomach drop as I realized what she was claiming, that there was some legitimate entity with the authority to sell lake access rights to a development company. But Patricia wasn't done. She clicked to her final slide, which showed an artist's rendering of what appeared to be a high-end resort development around the lake. Of course, Clearwater's plans include appropriate improvements, a small marina, a restaurant, some vacation rental cabins, all designed to blend seamlessly with our natural environment while providing economic benefits to our entire community. Now I understood her endgame. She couldn't control the lake through her fake HOA anymore, So she was planning to sell access rights she didn't possess to a development company that would destroy the very environment she claimed to be protecting. It was time to speak up. "That's the most outrageous lie I've ever heard," I said, standing up at the back of the room. Every head turned toward me. Patricia's expression shifted from surprised to furious in an instant. "David, you weren't invited to this meeting," she said coldly. "I'm a property owner here, same as everyone else," I replied, walking toward the front of the room. "And unlike you, I actually have legal standing to discuss lake access rights." I turned to address the room. "How many of you have seen the actual covenant documents Patricia keeps referencing? How many have verified that this HOA is legally incorporated? How many have checked with the county to confirm that community lake access rights even exist?" The silence was telling. Patricia had relied on people's assumption that someone else had verified her authority. "Patricia Hendricks has been running a sophisticated fraud scheme," I continued. "There is no legally recorded HOA. There are no enforceable covenants. And she has no authority whatsoever to sell lake access rights to anyone." Patricia tried to regain control. "David, you're clearly desperate to discredit legitimate community governance." "Legitimate?" I interrupted. I pulled out copies of my research and began distributing them to the shocked audience. These are the actual property records from the county recorder's office. No covenants. No legal HOA. No community lake access rights. As people read through the documents, the mood in the room shifted dramatically. Patricia's supporters began looking uncomfortable, while property owners who'd been paying her fake fees appeared increasingly angry. Marcus stood up, his face red with rage. "Patricia, I've paid you over $1,500 in fees over the past iframe.